Hello, I'm Colonel Tino Perez, a teacher at the U.S. Army War College, and welcome back to the series on Strategy is Performance. And we've been talking about the fact that strategy means doing things. One of the four things that it means doing is normative evaluation. And that's what we're going to focus on today, and more specifically, the specification of interests. So what I want to start off with is the default understanding that we have at the U.S. Army War College when you ask many students, what are our interests? What are our national security interests? What they will often do is have recourse to two things. One of them, they'll say, well, you look at the Constitution. Provide for the common defense, for instance. Or the students will look at the national security strategy, where it specifies that one of the things that we want to do is protect the homeland. But what I want to say is that these definitions or specifications of interest are too broad. What it means to provide for the common defense, what it means to protect the homeland is susceptible of a wide range of interpretation that can include aggressive, hawkish behavior or more dovish behavior insofar as we're talking about foreign policy and national security on the international scale. So I want to complicate this understanding of the Constitution and the national security strategy as being the source of our interests. My argument is that we need to do more analysis in terms of preparing to argue in the highest sense of the term about what are the ends, the aims, the objectives that we should be trying to realize as a strategist and advisors on strategy. So the first way that I want to complicate the simple understanding of recourse to the Constitution and charter documents like the strategy is to discern between three types of interests. And what I'm taking here is I'm taking these ideas from Jeff Isaac, one of my teachers at Indiana University, who wrote an article a long time ago that made the distinction between three types of interests. One of them is subjective. The second is objective interest. And the third one is real interests. And they're all useful to us. These categories are obviously open to contestation by other scholars, by other practitioners, but the distinctions we make here I think are useful. So when we talk about subjective interests at the individual level, for example, my role as a teacher at the U.S. Army War College, one could say, or I could say that my subjective interest is in giving YouTube videos on the topics of strategy and strategic education. My interest is in providing a classroom environment in which students do research, break open real-world problems, go to the whiteboard, map out those problems, and then propose interventions, as opposed to simply reading a book and then discussing it in class. These are my subjective interests. They are my own. But there are also such a thing as objective interests or postulated interests that other people looking at my performance in the classroom might say I should be doing. So for instance, in the National Defense Strategy, the current Secretary of Defense argues that that professional military education has grown stagnant, and that the implication being that teachers in the classroom need to do things differently. Among the things that National Defense Strategy says we should be doing is focusing on war fighting, on lethality, and on ingenuity. Well, that is an example of an objective interest that someone outside of my role has about what I should be doing. And it's different. Now, it's not necessarily in contestation or in conflict with the previous interests, the subjective interests I specified, but they are different. And then finally, there's something called real interests, which is a function of the role that I officially play as a teacher at the U.S. Army War College. So if my subjective interest is, say, giving YouTube videos on strategy, and one objective interest might be from Secretary Mattis in teaching about lethality and warfighting and ingenuity in the classroom, a real interest is a function of my role, which is my real interests are to go to class at 8:30 in the morning, to teach a certain curriculum that my department chair has given me to teach to the students, to evaluate those students both in the classroom and in their writing performance, and then finally to give them grades. So these are three different ways of understanding interests. You can imagine how they easily translate then to the nation-state level, where the subjective interests of, say, the United States might be with the current president who says that we are now in a competitive environment in which we should put America first. The objective interest from someone, say, a journalist or an academic might say, well, your actual interest, your objective interest, is to actually cooperate internationally. And then the real interest might be specified by a political scientist that says you are a nation state with certain borders and certain citizens, and your task is to protect those citizens and to protect those borders and to advance your goals overseas. Well, these are all different specifications of interest, and they complicate a simple recourse to the U.S. Constitution or the national security strategy. So I'll stop there. I will make a point, though, that all of these are open to contestation, and that when, for instance, a subjective interest is given, for instance, that we should put America first, the argument that an advocate of that position would offer is that the environment, the obstacle course, and we've used this language in previous episodes, the obstacle course elicits or compels this prioritization of America first in the world, when in actuality it's an ideational decision that the president has made in order how to negotiate that obstacle course. Whereas you could have another president who would say we need to focus on international cooperation to achieve our goals, and that president too might say, well, the environment summons or compels this strategy. In reality, it's when we specify our interests, it's a combination of ideas in people's heads that are subjective, and it's a combination of the landscape and what it demands. So I'll move on. Another point I want to emphasize is that interests change. So if we think of the landscape or the obstacle course as a kaleidoscope, where the elements in the kaleidoscope are not hard grains, but they're more like fluid or they're like gelatin. And as you rotate the kaleidoscope, what you'll see is that some pieces of gelatin break off from larger pieces. They'll combine with others, they'll form new ones, and it continues to change. The obstacle course in which we are participating as national security actors or as military actors is constantly changing. So there's no way to specify interests always and forever as stated in the Constitution or in a strategy. We always have to be attentive first to the landscape. What constraints and windows of opportunity does that landscape present to us? And then given that new configuration, what interests can we now discern that we didn't discern before? Today, we have many interests with respect to nuclear proliferation, for instance. But at the beginning of the 1900s, that was not a concern because the configuration of the landscape in which we were operating simply did not present nuclear weapons as something in the world to be worried about. They had not existed yet. So the priority, once again, is the landscape and not the specification of interest. The latter is driven by the former. The next thing I want to talk about is the hierarchy of interests. So one of the things that I see both in headquarters and in the military education environment is the students' desire to simply go to the highest element that we deal with, in this case national security, and then find those interests specified in charter documents, the Constitution, National Security Strategy, National Defense Strategy, the global employment of forces, for instance, and then take those and then say, well, those are our interests, they're already laid out, now we just need to go to work and how do we execute them? What I want to say is that the environment or the obstacle course looks different at every single level. So one of the things that I used to work was security cooperation with certain nations. And it was interesting to see, from my perspective, at an Army Service Component Command, that the National Security Council had representatives on it that were concerned about one of these countries. The Department of Defense also, and the Office of the Secretary of Defense also had persons who were very interested in that country. And you could say the same about the Joint Staff, about the Combatant Command, about my Service Component Command, and the Service Component Commands for the other forces. There were several other interagency reps that also had a perspective on the way things should go with respect to these countries. The landscape looks different depending on where you sit in the environment, and it always requires the responsible strategist to read the configuration of the dynamics of play, the constellation of the dynamics of play, identify constraints, identify windows of opportunity, and decide how to intervene at the appropriate level. To be sure, all these interests that we lay out, all these objectives, all these aims, all these ends are hierarchically organized. We cannot go against a higher headquarters. But there's always a wide latitude with what is desired at the national security strategy to what we must do down here at a lower level. And so there's always a lot of latitude in play. And the advice that I like to give to planners and to students is, look, you look at the higher guidance, the specification of interests and aims, you put that away, and then you study the environment on behalf of your commander, periodically briefing your commander, and you say, based on our analysis, sir or ma'am, here's how we should intervene in the environment. It does not conflict and in fact supports what is specified above. And that's a good way of going about it. And what this puts to use is the idea of creativity, which is what I want to talk about next. One of the things I've heard both in headquarters and here in the educational environment for the military is this idea that, look, we are doing lots of activities, many and varied activities. And what we need to do is to go back to the charter documents, the orders that have been given that force that activity to be done at our level. And the implication being that if some activity is found not to be tied to a specific mandate to do it, then we should stop doing it. And I think that's a dangerous attitude to take with respect to national security strategy and military strategy, because what we're also doing when we advocate that practice, we're also inconsistently also advocating for creativity. That is, we want national security strategists who are creative in coming up with solutions to problems. My argument is you can't have one without and the other at the same time. You can't say get rid of all activities that are not tied to a mandate and at the same time request your planners, your strategists to be creative. So what we always want to do, regardless of where we sit, it could be on the National Security Council, it could be in a combatant command, it could be in a service component command, it could be in a Department of State and an embassy. What we're always asked to do as responsible strategists is, and you've seen this before, is look at the configuration of forces, the things in the world, discern what objective we want to reach, and then how best to intervene in that landscape in order to move it closer to our desired state. This requires a lot of analysis, but by doing that, you also are able to generate creative solutions. There's no other way around it. And then the final thing, the next thing I want to talk about now is how it is that interests relate to outcomes. And here I want to draw on a political theorist named Hannah Arendt. And what she talked about was in politics, and remember, if we believe that Clausewitz is right, war is a subset of politics. In politics, when we act, we set things in motion through our freedom. And we specify things that we hope to achieve, but they can't be finely detailed in terms of the outcomes that we seek to create. So the example that Hannah Arendt gives is the idea of the American Revolution, where you had the founders of the country sign a Declaration of Independence saying they were going to break away from the parent country. Now, what they were doing then is signing a document that according to Arendt, was akin to specifying objectives that were, in her terms, for the sake of. We are declaring independence for the sake of liberty, so we're not oppressed, was the narrative. The opposite of doing this is having detailed outcomes and that are supposed to realize our interests. And the way she described that approach was in order to. As we specify our interests, as we argue about what they should be, as we argue in the highest sense about what objectives, aims, ends we wish to achieve in order to realize those interests, insofar as we're dealing with politics, we have to appreciate that we are always doing things for the sake of. That we're moving towards a desired state that we cannot fully specify in the terms of in order to. This we do in tactics, in lethal tactics all the time. We will destroy the company on objective red in order to allow team B to maneuver to the south. We don't do that in strategy. In politics, we don't know what the outcome is. So whenever we begin a war or begin a foreign policy initiative, it's always for the sake of some broader interest. So this is important. Now, the final thing I'll state is that all of the types of analysis that I've pointed to today are complicated by this notion of motivated reasoning. And I was listening to Ezra Klein in a recent episode, the Ezra Klein Show, a good podcast. He was interviewing a political scientist from University of Maryland, Lilliana Mason, and they were talking about this concept of motivated reasoning, in which the idea is that when we reason, when we use our minds, the idea is that our minds are not really truth-seeking machines, but they are actually reason-finding machines. And so what they said is, what we actually do is we specify something we want to argue about, our position, and then we find whatever evidence that we can and give reasons for supporting it, as opposed to, like philosophers going back to Plato argued, well, we actually want to find the truth, and so we'll study in order to find the truth, and that will give us the reasons for our positions. The interesting thing is, the more you know about a given situation, say it's politics, international affairs, or whatever, the actually more pernicious and the more salient this dynamic is. So as you're working through the distinction between real, subjective, and objective interests, as you're looking at hierarchy of interests and how to inject creativity into the specification of them, you have to be aware as a group that motivated reasoning is occurring and set up decision-making procedures in ways that mitigate and dampen the pernicious effects of motivated reasoning. That's all I have. In the next episode, we'll be talking about ethics as a part of normative evaluation. Thank you.